I never imagined a typical school day could become a life-altering event. Mr. Rivers, my teacher, always maintained a composed and professional demeanor. I respected his intelligence and calm nature. He was in his mid-40s, with distinguished streaks of gray in his neatly styled hair, and his glasses somehow added to his appeal. My admiration for him went beyond mere respect, carrying an unexplained element I couldn't define. He possessed a certain something that made me anticipate each class. One afternoon, after the final bell, I remained in the empty classroom, completing extra work. The only sounds were the subtle scratch of my pen and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Mr. Rivers's quiet approach went unnoticed until he softly spoke. "You're still here?" His voice startled me, and I glanced up, trying to hide my surprise. My heart pounded. "Yeah, just finishing this assignment." He offered a gentle smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You're always so dedicated. It's admirable." His tone held a different quality, warmer, perhaps even more personal. I felt my face flush and quickly looked down, feigning focus on my work. "You don't need to rush," he said, taking a seat at the adjacent desk. "It's just you and me here now." His words held an unexpected intimacy that made my breath catch in my throat. I'd always perceived him as an authoritative, somewhat distant figure, guiding us through lessons. Yet, in the deserted classroom, he seemed different, more accessible, more human. We sat in silence for a time, the unspoken tension growing with each passing moment. Finally, I looked up to meet his gaze. I saw something familiar in his eyes, something I'd noticed before. They weren't simply the eyes of a teacher. They were the eyes of a man. "I've noticed you've been a bit distracted lately," he said, leaning closer. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Before I could finish, he gently placed his hand on my arm, stopping me. The touch was soft, warm, sending a shiver down my spine. "It's okay. We all have things on our minds." His fingers lingered briefly before slowly withdrawing, leaving a tingling sensation on my skin. I wished he hadn't pulled away so quickly. The closeness felt novel, thrilling, yet slightly unnerving. I'd never considered my teacher in this light before. The student-teacher boundaries were blurring, and the uncertainty of the future was unsettling. "Mr. Rivers?" I whispered, barely able to speak, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions. "Call me James," he corrected, his voice low and warm. Hearing my teacher's given name felt strangely intimate, almost illicit. I hesitated before speaking again. "James, But the words wouldn't come. How could I articulate the confusion I felt, the pull towards him that I didn't fully comprehend? Before I could gather my thoughts, he stood, walked to the door, and locked it with a soft click. My heart pounded. We were completely alone. He turned back to me, his expression gentle yet serious. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I know this is unusual." I could barely breathe as he approached again. Standing so close, I felt his warmth. He reached out, tenderly brushing a strand of hair from my face, a gesture that sent a pang of longing through me. "I've watched you grow," he murmured, his fingers grazing my cheek. "Not just as a student, but as a person. You're thoughtful, kind, and there's something about you that draws me in, something I can't ignore anymore." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Was this actually happening? My mind urged me to stop, to remind him that this was forbidden, wrong. But my body disregarded these warnings. I leaned into his touch, yearning for the warmth and security he offered. "James," I whispered again, savoring his name. "This feels—" He smiled, his thumb gently tracing my jawline. "I know. Strange, but right at the same time." My breath grew shallow as he leaned in closer, his lips inches from mine. I felt his warm breath against my skin. I don't know who initiated the contact, but suddenly, our lips met. The kiss began softly, tentatively, as if we both feared crossing a point of no return. Then, as if propelled by an unseen force, it deepened. I felt his restrained passion, the emotions he'd suppressed, now unleashed. He pulled me closer, his hands on my waist, and I wrapped my arms around his neck, losing myself in the sensation. Every fiber of my being craved more of his touch, his closeness, the escalating heat between us. Time seemed to stand still. It was just the two of us, immersed in this forbidden yet undeniable connection. The outside world vanished, and all that mattered was how he made me feel, the unfamiliar desires he awakened within me. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. His forehead rested against mine, and I saw the conflict in his eyes, desire mingled with fear and uncertainty. "This can't happen," he whispered, his voice lacking conviction. I nodded, even though every part of me yearned to disagree. I knew he was right, but as we stood there, the unspoken connection between us hung heavy in the air. This was just the beginning. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how much we tried to deny it, there was no turning back. As the days passed, avoiding him became increasingly difficult. Every shared glance in the classroom, every brush of his hand against mine when he returned my papers, felt charged with an undeniable tension. I found myself constantly thinking about him, replaying our kiss, wondering if it had been a mistake or the start of something real. The lines between us blurred further with each passing day. He'd catch my eye, his gaze lingering a moment too long, and I'd feel the pull between us intensify. It felt as though we were both waiting for the moment we'd finally succumb to the undeniable attraction. About a week later, I lingered after class again. This time, I had no unfinished work. I simply wanted to be near him, to experience the feeling he evoked when we were alone. As the last student departed, I remained at my desk, a nervous anticipation churning in my stomach. "James," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mr. Rivers looked up, his eyes meeting mine. His expression held a flicker of understanding, as if he'd anticipated this moment. Without a word, he rose, walked to the door, and locked it. The click of the lock echoed in the quiet room, sending a shiver down my spine. My heart raced, my pulse throbbed in my ears as he turned to face me. "You stayed behind again," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I had to," I admitted, struggling to maintain a steady voice. "I can't stop thinking about you." He crossed the room slowly, closing the distance between us until he stood mere inches away. His hand reached out, cupping my face as he gazed down at me with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "I've been thinking about you, too," he whispered, his thumb brushing my cheek. "I tried to stay away, but I can't. There's something between us, something I can't ignore." His words sent a wave of warmth through me. I leaned into his touch, my heart pounding as I looked up at him. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He paused, his eyes reflecting the same conflict I'd witnessed after our first kiss. Then, slowly, his lips curved into a gentle smile. "We take it slow," he said softly, his other hand resting on my waist. "We figure this out together." I nodded, a wave of relief washing over me. This wasn't just a fleeting infatuation, a moment of weakness. There was something genuine between us, something worth exploring, despite the complications and risks. James leaned down, pressing his lips to mine once more. This time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was soft, sweet, filled with the promise of something more. His hands held me gently, as if I might shatter, and I melted into his embrace, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath coming in soft, shallow gasps. "We have to be careful," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "We can't let anyone know." "I know," I replied, my fingers tracing the collar of his shirt. "But I don't care. I just want to be with you." He smiled then, a soft, almost wistful smile, and kissed my forehead. "We'll find a way," he promised, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We'll figure this out, one step at a time." For the next few weeks we lived in stolen moments, shared glances across the classroom, fleeting touches when unnoticed, whispered words in private. It was thrilling, terrifying, and beautiful all at once. Every secret encounter felt precious, a piece of something we were building together, even though we knew it couldn't last. But as time went on, the weight of our secret grew heavier. It became harder to conceal, to pretend nothing had changed between us. The fear of discovery loomed over every shared moment, a constant reminder of the risk we were taking. And yet, I couldn't stay away from him. I didn't want to. One afternoon, as we sat together in his classroom after everyone else had left, James took my hand, his expression serious. I saw the familiar conflict in his eyes, the same conflict from the night of our first kiss. "We can't keep doing this," he said softly, his voice laced with regret. "As much as I want this, as much as I want you, it's too dangerous. If anyone finds out..." I knew he was right. We were living on borrowed time, and the truth would eventually surface. But knowing that didn't lessen the pain. "I don't want to lose you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. He squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with sadness. "You won't," he promised. "No matter what happens, you'll always have a place in my heart. But we have to stop this before it's too late." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I blinked them back, trying to hold on to this moment for just a little longer. "I don't know how to say goodbye," I admitted, my voice breaking. James pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. "You don't have to," he whispered against my hair. "This isn't goodbye. It's just a pause. We'll find each other again when the time is right." I nodded against his chest, my heart aching. Even though my heart ached at the thought of losing him, I knew James was right. We couldn't continue living in secrecy, hidden from the world. But I also knew what we shared wasn't over. It couldn't be. Not yet. We stood there for a long time, holding each other in the quiet emptiness of the classroom, neither of us willing to let go. When we finally parted, it felt like a piece of me was being torn away. Yet there was also a strange sense of peace. We'd experienced something beautiful, something real, and even though it had to end, I knew it would stay with me forever. As I left the classroom that day, I glanced back at him one last time. He stood by the window, watching me go, his expression bittersweet. I offered a small, sad smile, which he returned, his eyes filled with unspoken emotions. As I walked away, I knew that regardless of where life led us, a part of me would always belong to him, and a part of him would always belong to me. In the following days, I tried to move on, to concentrate on my studies, my friends, my life outside of the moments I'd shared with James. But it was impossible. Every time I entered that classroom, the memories flooded back. The stolen glances, the gentle touches, the kiss that had changed everything. It haunted me, lingering in every corner of the room, in every word he spoke to the class, in every look he gave me. He wasn't immune either. I saw it in the way his eyes would linger on me for a fraction too long, the way his voice would falter when he called on me, as if he struggled to contain his emotions, the way his hand would brush mine when he returned my papers, sending a jolt through me every time. But we never spoke of it again. We didn't need to. The tension between us spoke volumes, a constant, unspoken reminder of what had happened and what could no longer be. It was as if we were both waiting for something, a sign, a moment, that would allow us to return to the way things were before. But deep down, I knew that was impossible. One day, as I gathered my belongings after class, James stopped me. "Wait," he said quietly, his voice low so only I could hear. I froze, my heart pounding, and slowly turned to face him. He held my gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he said, "I'll miss you." The words hit me hard. I wasn't prepared for this, not truly ready to say goodbye. But I knew it was coming. I'd known for a while. "I'll miss you too," I whispered back, my throat constricting. There was so much more I wanted to say, so much I needed to express, but the words wouldn't form. I simply stood there, looking at him, wishing things could be different. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away, the weight of our unspoken emotions heavy in the air behind me. Leaving school that day, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss, not just for James, but for the person I'd been with him, the person who had felt wanted, desired, special. It felt as if that part of me had been left behind in that classroom, along with all the unspoken words. As the weeks passed, I began to heal. The ache in my chest dulled, the memories became less painful, and slowly, I started to move on. But I never forgot. I never could. Because no matter where life led us, a part of me would always belong to him, and a part of him would always belong to me.